Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into, well, a really innovative area of modern medicine. But it can also be, let's be honest, pretty complex. Digital health technologies, or DHTs. We're zeroing in on a fascinating paper from Clinical and Translational Science. It's from July 2023 by Izmailova, Demanuele, and McCarthy. And for you, our listener, here's the core puzzle we're going to try and unravel today. When your wearable device, maybe your watch, measures something like your step count or, how fast you walk, maybe even a tremor, is that data point a biomarker, or is it a clinical outcome assessment? And maybe more importantly, why does this distinction, which sounds a bit academic, actually matter so much? It seems like a subtle thing, but it has huge implications for developing new medicines and really for how patients like you might experience care down the line. It's definitely not just splitting hairs.
Exactly. That's really the heart of our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack this dual identity that these DHT-derived measures seem to have. We need to clarify the regulatory confusion it can cause and critically understand how these measures get developed and validated so they're actually, fit for purpose. Wow. Because the consequences of getting this wrong, well, they're huge, both for the people building these tools and ultimately for the patients waiting for better treatments. We'll definitely get into why that is.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we jump straight into the digital side, could you maybe set the stage? Help us understand the basic definitions first. In traditional medicine, what is a biomarker? And what do we mean by a clinical outcome assessment, or COA? These terms are going to be key.
Absolutely. Good place to start. Think of it like this. A biomarker is generally a physiological thing, a biological measure. So things like your ECG reading your heart activity or maybe your blood oxygen level, COAs, they give us an objective sign of a biological state, right? Or a process, maybe even how you're responding to a drug. Now, a clinical outcome assessment, a COA, that's different. It's designed to capture something much closer to the patient's actual lived experience. It measures how a patient feels or how they function day to day or, ultimately how they survive. So examples there might be gait speed, how fast someone walks, or the intensity of a tremor, or maybe how well they can do a specific task like buttoning a shirt. Now, some measures are clearly one or the other. The DHTs, this is where it gets interesting. They introduce these sort of hybrid measures. They can sit right on that line between a pure biomarker and a COA. They can actually serve both roles, but it really depends on the context, how they're being used in a particular study. The paper puts it quite plainly. DHT-derived measures can be leveraged as either clinical outcome assessments, COAs, or as biomarkers.
Right. And this ambiguity, this dual identity you mentioned, it isn't just theoretical. You said it's real and consequential for developers. Yeah. Why is that? Is it just about navigating regulatory hoops, or does it go deeper? Does it affect the quality or the real impact of these digital tools if you don't classify them correctly right from the start?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental. The stakes are incredibly high, really, because the path you take for regulatory approval and the sheer amount of evidence you need to gather, it differs dramatically based on how you classify that measure, COA or biomarker. Big difference. I mean, imagine a developer, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe they've poured years, millions of dollars into a new digital therapeutic, let's say for a neurological condition. And their key measure is maybe daily walking distance from a smartwatch. If they treat that just as a simple biomarker, just a physiological signal, and then later on regulators say, hang on, this needs to be validated as a COA, suddenly all their validation data might be inadequate. Maybe they didn't do patient interviews. Maybe they didn't establish what change is clinically meaningful to a patient. It's not just wasted time and money. It could literally mean that their treatment, years of work, might never actually reach the patients who need it. All because they missed that crucial classification up front. It's a real make or break decision.
Wow, okay. That really drives home the why it matters. So the definitions make sense in theory, but I think where this really clicks is seeing how these digital measures actually play out in real clinical trials. You mentioned the paper has some great examples where the same measure can wear different hats depending on the situation. Could you walk us through a couple of those?
Yeah, definitely. It's a perfect illustration of this fluidity. Let's start with Parkinson's disease. You often see smartphone or smartwatch apps used in trials to measure things like tremor or bradykinesia. That's just the technical term for slowness of movement. Now, in these trials, these measurements are typically used as COAs, clinical outcome assessments. Why? Well, because they're directly capturing the symptoms, the functional changes that really impact a patient's daily life. It reflects how they're actually experiencing the disease and its progression. It's about feeling and function.
Okay, so that's COA for Parkinson's symptoms. What else?
Then you have something like congestive heart failure, CHF. In this case, you might use an actigraphy device, basically a fancy activity tracker to measure a patient's overall physical activity, like activity counts. And this has been used successfully, but as a prognostic biomarker.
Ah, so predicting something.
Exactly. It's being used to predict mortality risk. That makes it more of a physiological measure indicating a potential future health outcome rather than directly reflecting how the patient feels or functions right now. It's a signal about the body's state, predicting something down the road.
Interesting distinction.
And then there's a really fantastic example in the paper, Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy, or DMD. For DMD, they used an ankle-worn wearable to measure something very specific called SV95C. That's the 95th percentile stride velocity. And this measure, it perfectly captures that dual identity we've been talking about. It can absolutely be used as a COA, as a functional endpoint, right? It directly tracks the patient's gait speed, how their disease is progressing functionally. It reflects their ability to walk.
Okay, it makes sense as a COA.
Okay.
But you said dual identity.
Right, because you can also look at it through a biomarker lens. It might be sensitive enough to detect really subtle physiological decline in the muscle function, maybe even before the symptoms become obvious to a doctor or even to the patient themselves. So it's measuring function, which is COA-like, but it's also potentially acting as an early physiological indicator, which is biomarker-like. It really sits on that boundary. So yeah, these examples really hammer home how the exact same measure from the very same device can play totally different roles. It all depends on how you frame it within the study and the specific disease context.
That fluidity across different diseases is fascinating, and it really highlights the challenge. So if a measure can be both, how does a developer actually decide which path to take? That early decision seems critical. And crucially, what are the different validation requirements? You said they were drastically different.
That is the absolute fork in the road, yes. Understanding that intended role, COA, or biomarker right from the start is paramount, because it dictates two very distinct validation journeys. If you decide your measure is going to be used as a biomarker, your main focus is analytical validation. People often talk about the V3 framework here, verification, validation, and utility. Essentially, you need to prove the device technically works.
So the tech side, accuracy, reliability.
Precisely. You need to verify its accuracy against some kind of gold standard. You need to show people actually wear it consistently, wear time compliance, demonstrate retest reliability. Does it give the same result under the same conditions? And you have to quantify things like measurement variability, how much data might be missing, any noise in the signal. It's all about the technical performance and the data quality itself.
Okay, that's the biomarker path. What about the COA path?
Right. Now, if you intend to use it as a COA, you need all of that rigorous analytical validation we just discussed, plus this whole extra layer, clinical validation. And this is where you prove that the measure is directly relevant to the patient's actual experience, their disease state as they live it.
How do you do that?
Well, a key part is using anchor-based thresholds. This means you have to show that changes in your digital measure, say a specific drop in gait speed measured by the device, actually correlate with how a patient reports feeling, or how a clinician assesses their overall condition using established scales, or even how they perform on traditional functional tests. You need to connect the digital number to a real-world outcome. You also need to conduct patient interviews, talk to patients directly, find out what these changes measured by the device actually mean to them in the context of their daily lives. Is a certain change meaningful? And, really importantly, you have to prove responsiveness to change over time in longitudinal studies. Does the measure actually pick up clinically important improvements or deteriorations as they happen? The paper really nails this point, noting, DHT-derived measures can be used as either The distinction can be very fine, leading to confusion regarding the evidence required from. And what's critical for you as a listener to grasp is this. Without that explicit link, that anchoring to human relevance in the patient experience, even the most technically precise digital measure might fail as a COA. It's simply not enough for a device to measure something accurately. The crucial question becomes, what does that measurement actually mean for a patient's quality of life, for their journey with the disease?
That makes perfect sense. It's about meaning, not just measurement. And the paper you said really highlights the SV95C measure in Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy as a case where they successfully navigated this. They got it right. It sounds like a blueprint. Could you really dig into that example for us? What specific evidence did they gather that made it such a strong case?
Yes, it's an excellent case study in doing this right. The SV95C measure, remember that's 95th percentile stride velocity from an ankle wearable, was studied really thoroughly. It was a secondary endpoint in a major trial called Spitfire WN40 4227, looking at boys with DMD, age 6 to 11. And importantly, they compared it directly against traditional COAs, things like the 6-minute walk test, the North Star ambulatory assessment, the 4-stair climb. That provided a crucial benchmark.
So how did it stack up?
Well, first, they meticulously established those anchor-based change thresholds. They showed, for instance, at week 24, SV95C declined by an average of NACS 0.07 meters per second. And crucially, they showed it correlated moderately well with those traditional COAs. The correlation coefficients were in the range of 0.6 to 0.7 at baseline, and still pretty solid, 0.4 to 0.7 at 48 weeks. So it was capturing something similar to what established tests were seeing.
Okay, so it aligned with existing measures. What about responsiveness? Could it detect changes?
This is where SV95C really shone. It demonstrated moderate responsiveness to change much earlier than the traditional tests. We're talking as early as week 12 with just 46 participants. The traditional COAs, they only reached that same level of moderate responsiveness much later, around week 36 to 48.
Wow, that's a big difference. Much more sensitive.
Exactly. It highlighted SV95C's higher sensitivity to picking up subtle, earlier changes in the patient's condition. In fact, the paper notes it could even detect short-term decline over just 3 months after a change in steroid treatment, while the standard tests needed more like 9 to 12 months to see a similar effect. It's a huge advantage. They also worked hard to define what change was actually clinically meaningful. Through analysis and, importantly, input from patients and clinicians, they determined that a decline of about Minago 0.10 to Pinago 0.20 meters per second was meaningful. It wasn't just a statistical blip. It was a change that exceeded the measurement noise and was considered relevant by the people actually experiencing and treating the disease. That blend is key.
And the underlying tech, the analytical validation.
Exceptionally strong. The SV95C device itself was shown to be highly accurate, 98.7% stride detection accuracy when validated against motion capture systems. That's very precise. Its month-to-month reliability was also excellent. The ICC, that intra-class correlation coefficient, was 0.97, which is incredibly consistent over time. And importantly, real-world feasibility was high. Wear time compliance was great. Over 88% of the boys met the target of wearing it for at least 180 hours during each evaluation period. So it worked reliably in the real world.
So you've got this incredibly thorough package. Strong analytical validation, clear clinical meaning, proven responsiveness, alignment with traditional measures. How did the regulators react to all of this? Did SV95C manage to break through?
The reaction has been very positive, yes. It really stands as a success story for navigating this complex process. The European Medicines Agency, the EMA, actually qualified SV95C back in 2019. They deemed it an acceptable secondary endpoint for ambulatory DMD patients aged 5 and older. That was a really significant step for a digital measure.
Secondary endpoint, okay. Yeah. Any movement beyond that?
Yes. Developers are now actually pursuing primary endpoint status, potentially for even younger patients. If successful, that would be a landmark achievement for DHT-derived measure. And on the U.S. side, the FDA's DDT COA pathway review for SV95C is ongoing, but the early signals are definitely supportive of its utility. You see official statements like, SV95C is an acceptable secondary endpoint when measured by a valid and suitable wearable device. That kind of language reflects regulatory confidence built on strong evidence.
And this fits with the broader regulatory picture.
Absolutely. It aligns perfectly with what we're seeing in recent guidance. The FDA's own remote DHT guidance from December 2023 explicitly states what we've been discussing, that DHT data can be used for both COAs and biomarkers, but they require different types of justification and evidence. And initiatives like patient-focused drug development, PFDD, they emphasize evaluating COAs based on construct validity, content validity, reliability, and responsiveness to change. So the regulatory environment is clearly reinforcing this idea. How you classify your endpoint right at the start is critical. It dictates the evidence you need and ultimately your chances of success.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. So pulling it all together, given this dual identity issue, the different validation paths, and the success story of SV95C, what are the key strategic takeaways? If someone is developing or maybe even just thinking about using these digital health measures in research or practice, what's the essential playbook here?
Yeah, the paper offers some very clear recommendations for navigating this landscape. I think the first, and maybe the most critical, is early endpoint framing. Decide right at the very start of your project, is this measure intended as a COA or a biomarker? Don't leave it ambiguous. That decision sets the direction for everything else.
Okay, decide early. What's next?
Second, analytical rigor is non-negotiable. That V3 level validation, making sure the tech is accurate, reliable, the data is clean, that's mandatory for both biomarkers and COAs. It's the foundation everything else is built on. Third, specifically for COAs, clinical validation is absolutely essential. You must use those anchor-based methods, robust statistics to establish meaningful thresholds, and crucially, make sure patient and clinician input is baked into that process from the beginning and throughout. The perspective is what gives the data real-world meaning. It can't just be numbers, people.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Yes, finally, multi-stakeholder collaboration. Engage early and keep talking to regulators, to patients, to clinicians. Work together to harmonize definitions, figure out what evidence is really needed, and participate in efforts like public-private partnerships. The paper mentions the iSTAND pilot, which are actively working to build consensus and establish standards for the whole field. Collaboration is key to moving forward effectively. And underpinning all of this, really, is that point about patient input. It's vital. It ensures these powerful new digital measures are actually relevant in the real world, that they truly reflect what matters most to the people living with these conditions. Without that patient anchor, even the most sophisticated tech risks just generating data rather than generating meaningful insights for health.
So there you have it, a really fascinating deep dive into digital health technology-derived measures, biomarkers, or clinical outcome assessments. It truly feels like the cutting edge where health tech meets regulatory science. It's definitely complex, but also brimming with potential.
Absolutely. I think the core takeaway is pretty clear. These digital endpoints, they're scientifically powerful, incredibly precise in many cases. But their success, whether in drug development or clinical practice, really hinges on getting that classification right from the very beginning. Solid analytical validation is the absolute baseline. And then for those measures intended as COAs, you need that robust clinical validation that anchors the digital data directly to what's relevant and meaningful for the patient. That part is non-negotiable.
Indeed. And it seems like when that's done right with the kind of strategic framing and evidence generation we saw with SV95C, a digital metric really can accelerate drug development. It could even become a primary endpoint, which is a huge deal. It really opens doors to getting new treatments to patients faster.
It really does. And maybe a final thought for you, our listener. As these digital health technologies become more and more a part of our everyday lives on our wrists and our pockets, how might these incredibly precise measurements, especially when anchored to what's meaningful for patients, change your experience of healthcare? Think about earlier diagnoses, more personalized treatments, managing chronic conditions maybe more effectively from home. What new possibilities really open up when the data streaming from your own devices becomes a validated, critical piece of your unique health story?